Have you ever experienced trauma in the workplace? Often, when we think of trauma, we think of capital T trauma, like the effects of physical abuse, natural disasters, etc. But lowercase t trauma is happening in the workplace all the time, and it's time for us to start addressing it. This week, I talked with Rosie Yeung, who describes herself as an unexecutive coach for Asian and racialized women. Here we talk about trauma in the workplace, what it looks like, and what we can begin to do about it. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Rosie. I cannot wait to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to it since you and I met, and I'm so excited to jump in. I'd love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit more about you and your story.
Oh gosh, yeah. Who am I and what's my story? Well, let's see. I pause for that because, we're going to get into it, but especially in this day and age when we're talking about how we show up at work, which parts of us show up at work. So it's not as simple anymore, right? To say, who am I? So I guess before I even introduce myself, we're kind of getting into the conversation. But the things that are important to me is that I am a Chinese Canadian immigrant, cisgendered woman, still living in Canada. I've lived pretty much my whole life here. I'm an only child to loving parents. We immigrated to Canada when I was a baby. And I am kind of a model minority person. I say that in air quotes because it is also important as we get later on into the conversation about how that impacts us psychologically. So I'm a good girl. I did all the right things. And I am now a coach. I'm the unexecutive coach for Asian and racialized women who want to escape or get rid of the blame, shame, and games that they've had to deal with their whole lives. So I'm really here to help other Asian women professionals who want to tame their triggers, calm their stress, and use their power in the workplace.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And are you comfortable sharing a little bit more about how you got to this point? Like, what did your work life look like before you decided I'm going to become a resource to other women who maybe have had similar experiences?
Completely. And I paused there. There's a lot. See, that's the thing. There's a lot we could say about our identities, right? Because we are whole people and complicated. So I deliberately paused there because I didn't want to overload individuals. But the reason why I am now the unexecutive coach for Asian women is because my background initially is as a CPA, a chartered professional accountant, and a certified HR leader. So I was your classic, work hard, rise up the ranks, professional executive. I worked in for-profit organizations. I worked in not-for-profit organizations. And I'll tell you that in capitalism, it's all the same. It doesn't matter if the organization is out to try to make money or out to be a charity and fundraise money. The system of capitalism works the same. And I say that specifically because it still impacts people and it causes workplace trauma, which I know we're going to get into as well. So when I was laid off at the beginning of 2020, it was after a 20 plus year career doing all those things, right? Like rising up the ranks, doing everything doing everything right, constantly worried and trying to outperform my last high performance, which is impossible. And so there's a lot of layers there too that we can also discuss when we talk about trauma in the workplace. So like why we can be so driven and what it does to us. But when the opportunity came to not do that anymore in 2020, that was when I decided to take a different path, a path to follow my passion versus trying to make my passion fit my professional career, the career that I was educated for and kind of trained for in the workplace. But I was never satisfied and never happy. So I never wanted to be a coach, actually, also because I saw the way executive coaches were in the workplace. And to me, executive coaching, it is meant to help people, and it does. So I'm not trying to say all executive coaching is bad. But ultimately, when it's about so-called helping people be better leaders, really what I saw was that it was grooming people to be more like what we see are the majority executives today, which are white males. And white males that present a certain way, like they present executive. So hence I am trying to break that status quo by being an unexecutive coach. To me, that means being true to your identity, to deciding what is right for you. Doesn't mean being more this culture or this race or this gender. It is about what is actually inherent in you, what's already in your inner knowing, the knowledge that you bring without having to dress a certain way or sound a certain way or look a certain way. We can talk about authenticity and what that really is as well. It's going beyond that. It is about not having to follow all the leadership books that are written by white men and all the professional training and corporate training that is taught by white men and white women, which is then upholding whiteness. And that's what I did for 20 years as a professional trying to be more white. So it was a turning point for me that I didn't even know I needed. And now I am coaching.
I love everything that you said, and I'm particularly really struck by the unexecutive term that you use, because that has been an identity crisis for me throughout my entire journey as a coach, because it does not feel authentic to me to call myself an executive coach. And unfortunately, I feel like I've been reluctant to be creative with how I define myself, because it's so much easier as a shortcut to just say, this is what everyone knows, generally speaking, that there are coaches out there. And rather than having to get into a lengthy explanation about what I do, I just kind of use that term, right? But the way that you described that resonates with me so much, because it's just, I've always resisted feeling like the person who helps white men get more successful or helps other people conform to that very narrow model, which just doesn't work for most people, including a lot of white men, right? So I think that that's a really important part of this conversation too. And I want to get into the conversation around trauma, which, is really what drew me to you and your work. And I'd love to have a sense or an opportunity to hear a little bit more about what does trauma mean to you in the workplace? Because I think we all have our own sort of individual definitions of what trauma means, but how do you define it for the purposes of your work?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And just so that your listeners, for you who's listening right now, a little bit of explanation. So I've shared that my background is not as a medical professional or even as a trauma researcher or any kind of a trauma expert. I'm very new to this myself. I've been learning a lot because I've experienced trauma. I've experienced trauma from getting fired. And I'll get into that because I think a lot of people have been getting fired, especially in the last few years, and I want to address that. And I have experienced trauma just from day-to-day work. I've experienced trauma in my family life, in my friends' life. I think we've all experienced some degree of trauma through COVID and the pandemic. So it's important for me to, yes, let's explain how I see trauma and maybe some definitions, because I'm in the process right now of getting certified as a trauma recovery coach. So I am learning, and there's a certain amount of professional technical knowledge I am bringing to this now. And so I do also want to just say that none of this is like medical advice. The certification is helping me to be a mental health professional or a mental health practitioner. But this is something for people to help better understand, and particularly understand through a lens of their own identity. I come with a lens of being a racialized woman, an Asian Canadian immigrant woman. Like I said, the model minority idea, and we'll talk about what trauma looks like for that as well, or the trauma impacts, and a professional who worked in a white collar environment for very long. So that looks different also in different workplaces, right? So getting to your original question about then what trauma is or what it looks like, From the many highly respected trauma experts I've been learning from, including Dr. Gabor Mate, who I will be quoting a lot, at the heart of it, trauma is not what happens to you. I think let's do a little bit of myth busting about what trauma is and what trauma isn't. So the trauma probably people tend to think of, and it is trauma, is the like natural disasters, earthquake, floods, war in Ukraine. And absolutely, these are traumatic events. Whether people end up being traumatized by them or not, it's different for each person. So it's not to say that, oh, some people are going to be fine coming out of a massive earthquake that killed their whole family and destroyed their house. More than likely, they will be traumatized. But the nature of what trauma is, it's like an injury, right? So it's a psychic or an emotional injury. And depending on the person and how physically, like some people can deal with a broken arm, they heal from it faster than other people might heal from a broken arm. The injury is the same. How it ends up impacting the person, particularly long-term, is different. So Dr. Mate says, trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what happens inside you. And how it hits is going to be different for each person. Trauma is also not the event itself. So it's not what happens to you. Happening inside you, meaning if somebody has a broken arm, and if that broken arm is properly dealt with by a doctor, it's treated, it's x-rayed, it's set in a cast, it's given the right time to heal and rest, right? They don't have to go back to work and keep re-injuring the arm. Then it's going to heal properly and well, and they're going to regain full use of that arm, right? That would be full recovery from the traumatic incident and from the trauma they suffered. If it isn't diagnosed properly, if it's not treated properly, again, I'm not a medical doctor, but I've seen lots of medical shows, right? So I'm talking out of my TV medical knowledge. But if that broken arm isn't treated properly, right, and it's never set in a cast, it maybe gets infected, it gets gangrenous, like it gets gangrene. So then all these other problems can come out of it, right? That maybe I'll get gross, right? It could get pussy. The bone might be sticking out. Like there's a lot of other medical problems that then come from what was originally just a broken arm. And so that's what happens when the trauma injury is not recognized, diagnosed, and given time to be treated, to be cared for, to be healed. And so that trauma never gets better. Or sometimes it could be like if you get a cut on your arm, and maybe it sort of heals on its own, but it doesn't heal very well. Like broken bones can also heal on their own. But if they're not healed properly, like not set properly, then it heals back deformed, right? Or it heals back with a really thick, horrible scar that it's not so much that it's ugly, but it's very tight, it's uncomfortable. Again, it's not a healthy healing. It's not a whole healing of the original wound. And so I think most of us, myself included, are walking around with these improperly healed or never healed wounds that, because they're not properly healed, the triggers, right? Like it's like, oh, you brush up your unhealed broken arm against something, it's going to hurt a heck of a lot more, right? Than someone whose broken arm is fully healed and it doesn't hurt anymore. So this is, then this gets into some of the longer term impacts and how trauma can get re-injured or re-traumatized by sometimes the so-called smallest of things. And then people get called too sensitive and all sorts of stuff, which, yeah, there's a whole lot more that we can get into. But ultimately, it's about what happened to us and how we responded to it or reacted to it. And then how we were cared for or how we cared for ourselves out of that.
I love the way you're describing the more holistic experience, because there's so many different layers to what you're saying. But essentially, it's not just about our healing as an individual, but around the sort of support system that provides the care, right? Because we're not, most of the time when you break your arm, you're not the one that's setting it in a cast, right? You're not the one who's responsible for, or, sort of taking care of you as you're recovering from that. And I think a lot of times when we think about the kind of trauma, perhaps that you're referencing, and I'm looking forward to getting more into what workplace trauma means, we often think of that as like the individual's responsibility, right? And so it's like, it's not just about me and whether or not I'm a fast healer, but am I in an environment that is more likely to re-injure that, right? And am I in a space where I have more narrow room to avoid the kinds of triggers that are likely to continue to perpetuate this wound, right? So I'd love to hear more about your perspective on that too, and really when it makes sense to do so, to bring in the workplace, because I think that's not. And you and I sort of talked offline about this too, is like, sometimes I hesitate to use the word trauma because although I believe that that's what's happening, because we tend to associate trauma with the big T traumas that you're talking about, like being in a war or having these major disastrous events. I don't want to minimize what those unfortunate victims are going through, but at the same time, to be able to recognize the very real pain that people are subjected to, often on a regular basis, that then gets compounded by this, you're too sensitive, not even recognizing that there is an injury there. Like somebody breaks their arm, you're more sympathetic, right? Like you can see it, but there's a lot of invisible trauma around us that we don't recognize or we don't necessarily see as legitimate.
I love that you named invisible trauma. There's a lot of things that are like, I learned a couple years ago about invisible disabilities, right? So if we're talking also about workplaces that want to be more equitable and inclusive and accommodating, which that can be a triggering word because it implies you're different and I need to somehow make my normalcy work around your abnormalcy, right? But the idea that most trauma cannot be seen. And I think that's also where, in a workplace setting, which is all about objective data and evidence, and it's not personal, it's business, right? So this artificial separation, which is true of every, again, in a capitalist corporate system, which most of North America and Europe is, it is very damaging because in the same way that definitely in this conversation and in general, you and I were very clear. We don't want to minimize the quote unquote big T trauma, right? The earthquakes and the wars, deaths and violence and rape and all sorts of stuff that happens as absolutely horrible things and can cause very deep trauma. Those because they are more accepted as trauma, then there's a whole bunch of the other so-called small t or little t trauma, which is, it can happen day to day. And it happens, I think, particularly at work, because there's this false idea of your personal needs are not business, therefore I don't have to take care of them. And in fact, if I'm speaking from my HR and people leader, like people management experience, if I am so good as to accommodate your personal needs, because you happen to like to, take a lunch hour and go do yoga. Wow, aren't I a great employer that I create a yoga room for you, right? Or give you a whole hour or even an hour and a half to do your yoga and then eat something and then come back to a meeting. These are human needs. Human needs is not just food and shelter, and even like relationship. Like there's certain recognition of what has been known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And say, oh, those are legitimate needs. But the need for acceptance and affirmation in whatever form that takes, it could be verbal, it could be literally a pat on the back, it could be like a physical affirmation, right? It could be recognition of somebody's work more than just once a year in their annual performance review. These are also deep human needs. And the constant tension between the need, also a deep human need to be authentic. And by authentic, I don't just mean to a gender or a race or a culture, but to who they are as an individual, right? To my personality, my gut instinct, my sense of right or wrong, and my personal integrity. There's been many, many times at work where not that the company's illegal or unethical, but I don't agree with their belief system or their philosophy. And I have to sacrifice my personal belief and value in order to not lose my job or in order to fit in socially at work. And again, Dr. Mate describes that as a traumatic tension, the tension between being accepted by whatever community it is. It's at work, it's socially, it's in your family, to have to hide away parts of ourselves or even deny, like go do the opposite of what we believe and what we want, feels good for us in order to fit in order to be accepted. And that, again, those are two fundamental human needs that are true of any race, of any culture, of any gender. But so often in a work context, because the employer holds the power, there's actually this idea of, well, because I pay you, I have the right to tell you what to think, how to behave, what to do. And if I don't like it, then you can't do it, period. And if you don't like it, then you have to go find another job. So it's this constant battle. Like I found myself every day. Only now that I'm working for myself can I still can't because it's still capitalist and I need money. But I can choose to, I suddenly have to go get my prescription filled at the drugstore. That happened yesterday. I don't have to ask anybody's permission. I don't have to say, well, I will make it up by spending an extra hour after work to do stuff. I just go do it. And so often now when I talk about flexibility, it's like, well, what do you mean? It's just life. The idea that my time is not my own, that I am not my own person. I'm owned by someone else. That can be traumatizing depending on how supportive, again, speaking to your point about what the community and the social setting around them, depending on how so much support they have outside of work, constantly having to be owned by your employer can be traumatizing.
And what you're making me think about too, when you talk about this power imbalance, right? And I think about this a lot because so many of the people that I've worked with over the years or that I've come to know over the years, the way that I've described it is that it almost feels like there's this sense that I'm hanging by a thread at work, right? Like I'm just this one misstep away from being fired or from, losing out on opportunities or doing it wrong in some way that's going to negatively affect my career. And so you talk about the ways in which we have to deny our own authenticity, our values, what we stand for in order to follow these rules and conform to the expectations of others. And on top of that, there's this added energy, this added layer of being so fearful of what might happen if we don't, right? And then, and also not even always knowing what is the quote unquote right way to do something. And so I'm living in this state of anxiety of this person, and we're not necessarily thinking about this consciously, right? But there's this sort of feeling that this person, this entity, whether it's my boss, whether it's my organization, has power over my life, right? Because whether or not I can feed my family depends on my ability to hold a job. And so I have to not only do these things that are counter to how I would naturally do things, but if I don't, I might be homeless. I might be, unemployable in the future. Like, and, all the stories that we sort of tell each other. So the power of this experience gets magnified so much. And so can you talk a little bit about that aspect of it as well?
Yes. Oh gosh, there's so much there to talk about because what you're reminding me of also is just what's also inherent in every human being, which is our response to trauma system, right? So the classic fight, flight, freeze. Mm-hmm. If we are feeling under threat, which a power imbalance, there's always an implicit threat. And I think that's part of the invisibility and the lack of recognition around how at any moment somebody could get triggered, right? Because like I had I will talk a little bit about my experience at work, just to give some practicalness to it. And also maybe people can relate. I've been on both sides of the firing table, right? So as an HR person and as a people manager, I have fired many people and I always justified it. I mean, I never felt, well, I hope that I never fired anybody without cause, right? Without in any unethical or unreasonable way. I saw many, many times where no matter how well documented or how justified I and the employer felt that was because the person wasn't performing. They were not keeping up their end of the employer-employee contract, etc. Sometimes the individual got, if the employer took enough time to really explain ahead of the firing incident, to give proper performance feedback, to have a communication and not just I'm the boss and what I say goes, but an actual, okay, how can we work this out, right? Like, here's what you're not doing, or here's what we expect of you, but you're not able to achieve that. Here's how we're trying to support you. I can tell you that no matter what, the employee pretty much never feels like that really happened for them. And that goes into whole thing about HR stuff, which I won't get into. But then the trauma happens, or can happen, when they're at the firing table and they're like, what on earth, right? And the inherent lack of power. So in the old days, like Neanderthal days, which we still carry with us in our fight and flight and freeze system, the trauma or the potential traumatization of that individual would happen around, well, how do they end up responding? If they feel, first of all, that it was completely out of the blue for them, that could be a huge shock, right? And for individuals, especially these days in our economy, a lot of people are getting fired in that way. They're getting laid off. It was not a complete shock because they know the economy is not great, but still they never expected it in their company, or not at this time, or not to them. Incident number one. And then how have they been supported? To your point, Kim, about, what is their support system like? If they don't even have other support systems, like if they've never had support to let them feel like, no, just because they got fired doesn't mean they're not worthy, doesn't mean they're never going to find another job, doesn't mean that it was personal against them. Even when it was personal against them, it doesn't define their identity. It doesn't mean that they're wrong and the employer's right. How much do they feel that? And that comes from themselves as a person, as well as how much they were nurtured, how much they're nurtured by their friends, how much they're nurtured by their family, right? And certainly how the message is coming from the employer as well. Again, I don't think anything really sinks in because we're all in shock, like we're traumatized in the moment. So then it gets into a whole bunch of stuff which we don't have time for here, but the biological response. And this is also, I think, a bit of a myth busting. There is an actual many biological responses in our body, our nervous system, how our brain reacts, like the chemistry, things that present as depression and anxiety or ADHD. It's not that they're not those things, but they are not necessarily independent of the trauma that we've suffered, right? Many times those are actually the long-term impacts, kind of like what we said earlier about the injuries, right? Like what is a scar could be then ADHD or depression. It's how we ended up coping with a traumatic incident. So yeah, there's many ways. Like I talked about one event, and this is another way to think about trauma. It can present in many different ways, most of them invisible. So a firing is a more visible event, and that also helps us deal with the trauma that we're suffering because at least we can attach it to something. Oftentimes, the more insidious stuff is when we don't get something that we need, right? So trauma is also not just what happens to you, it's what happens inside you, but it's also not necessarily something bad that happens to you. It's good things that should have happened but didn't.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. And it could also be something happened too much too soon. So you got fired all at once unexpectedly. Too much too soon is like a flash incident. It could be that you're going through something for too much for too long. Maybe your boss is constantly giving little insidious, nasty comments, like, "Oh, Kim, well, thanks for showing up again at this meeting," right? Like, finally, you walk in the door, and maybe you're dealing with something. So it just depends how well you're treated. It could also be too little for too long, right? That's you deserve something or you need something, but you don't get it. Right. So if you're just constantly, your boss only comes and talks to you when he needs something from you or she needs something from you. And meanwhile, you're not getting any affirmation or any recognition. You're the giver, right? You're like, okay, yes, I can do that. No problem. Yes. You need me to stay late? Well, I have this thing, but if you really need me, okay, I guess I will. And then the work, like you said, Kim, it tends to be, I'll blame the employee. Well, the employee should have said no, or the employee needs to set up boundaries, right? Or the employee needs to or should have or could have, blah, 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 blah. There's very little accountability on the employer side. And it's not just a business relationship. If we're all humans, we all have our human needs, and not having your basic human needs met, which includes the need for rest, the need for emotional connection. If those are not met for a long time, then that can also lead to trauma.
So, oh gosh, so much gold there. And, you're making me think about a couple of things. First of all, like you said, it's the employee should set the boundaries at the same time that the employee is terrified that if they do, they're going to be fired, right? So that goes back to that implicit threat that you described. The other thing that I have observed within myself as a high anxiety individual, somebody who's been suffering with anxiety my entire life, as well as just having had the privilege of working with so many people over the years, is that when you describe that need that's not being met, there's the need that's not being met, and oftentimes the doubt that it's a legitimate need that should be met in the first place, right? So it's like we're all egocentric beings by nature. We only see the world through our own eyes, and we don't share. We don't have access to other people's behind the scenes stories within our workplaces the vast majority of the time. And so all we have to go on is the visual cues that are available to us. And if we look around and we think everyone else seems happy, everyone else seems calm, everyone else seems like they're doing it right, and I have this tension or this sort of friction that maybe I can't even name, but I feel wrong in some way, must be me, right? It's not because there's this legitimate human need that I have that's not being met. It's I'm too needy, or, maybe I should just let go of that expectation. If only I change this part of myself, then I can be more like these people, and then I can keep up and do all the things that are expected of me.
Yes. There's so many things that have become normalized that are at best myths, social myths, and also I want to say they're lies, but they're lies that we've all told ourselves. It's the idea that we just don't know if there's something better if we've never ever had it. Right? Like pay equity. I can take that as a little bit more concrete of an example. If women had no idea that what they're getting paid, let's say they're getting paid, whatever, $10 an hour, if they think that that's the norm and they're happy with that, it's like, oh yeah, that's normal. That's what everybody gets. It's like, okay, I don't even know to ask. I don't even know that there is something better out there. Then all of a sudden stuff starts coming out. Oh, wait a minute. How come that man is getting paid $15 an hour, or somebody who was hired after me is getting, why are there these differences? Then we can start having the conversation about, well, who should be getting, well, maybe I should be getting more. It doesn't change what you brought up very rightly, the self-doubt, which, gosh, so, parts of the thing around trauma is the shame and the not believing in your, like the idea that, well, you just need to be more confident. That's how you're going to be an executive. That's how you can be a leader. How do people learn to be confident? Where does their confidence come from? If they've never received the messages, the nurturing that tells them their confidence comes from the fact that they're unconditionally loved and unconditionally accepted, why on earth would they believe that they're worth anything more? Why on earth would they think that they could lead a team or an organization or whatever it is, right? So it also kills me that companies are so separate from what happens in the home. As if if moms or dads or parents, right? If you want to spend time with your family, that's for after work. That's outside of work time. What happens long term to the kids who don't see their parents, don't get enough nurturing and the things that bring forth confidence and self-worth and self-belief, and then the ability to be like, oh no, I do deserve this for myself. I can set boundaries. Right? I can self-advocate, or I can bring up ideas in a meeting and initiate projects because I'm not terrified I'm going to get shut down or rejected. If that nurturing and that care doesn't happen in the home, how does that not impact companies down the road?
You're so right.
right? Like we're a society. We are all together in this. It is not, well, it's their parents' responsibility to bring up good kids. And then it's the school's responsibility to teach them what they need to know. And then as an employer, I actually have no responsibility because I pay them. Therefore, they owe me their work. And it's the school's fault, or it's the parents' fault, or it's the medical system's fault, or it's anybody else's fault. That's where I think we need to start changing the narrative and holding all parts of society, including employers, accountable for how are we relationally and how are we building healthy individuals within a healthy society.
What can we do in that realm, right? And obviously you don't have the all the answers to this, right? Or we wouldn't be in this situation.
Oh, I'd bottle it and sell it, Kim.
If only, right? But I'm curious what your thoughts are on, because I struggle with this too, right? I tend to be an optimist by nature. I feel really mission driven in the work that I do. And there are days when I'm riding high and thinking like, yes, I'm making a difference. And then there are days when I want to curl up in the fetal position and say, this problem is just too big, right? Like this is, we feel so powerless sometimes against this system that's so hard to even bite into. So what do you think is a reasonable or even just a first step? Like, what do we do? How do we think differently? How do we either challenge the system, or what do we do? Yes.
Yes. Let me share my secret formula with you to fix all of society's problems, right? Yeah, so I do, of course, I do have some thoughts, and sort of like how we don't like talking about trauma, or we have a bit of blinders on maybe around trauma. I think we don't like talking about what the solutions are, or I think we also have some blinders on about really how simple some of these, what we can do could be, because it's such a big problem. Often we think we need big solutions to big problems, but just like trauma can be too little for too long, the solution could also be little things for a long time. And the impact of little things could be very big. I think this is also a capitalist corporate idea of, oh, well, to have a big impact, something has to be really super inspirational or like a massive thing. And then we need a strategic implementation plan, right, to make that happen. So I've my 3 C's. I have 3 C's on this. And this is true for anybody on either side of the privilege fence or the trauma fence. It starts with curiosity. But instead of a accusatory or but it's not my fault or who's to blame, it's, okay, what's happening here? And if I take a CEO or people in leadership positions, which I was in for a long time, rather than looking for ways to say, but we do accommodate employees. Like we have a healthcare plan, we have this, like what more do they want from us? I think that's a lot of the messaging, the narrative that comes up. And I'm assuming at this point, good intentions, right? Like, and I think most employers are not going out intentionally trying to make employees' lives miserable. But the fact is, employees' lives are pretty miserable. And I include leadership in that because they are employees too. So getting curious about what's behind your reaction, your response to whatever it is, right? Like if you're the one getting triggered, and anybody can get triggered, if you're getting triggered, what's coming up for you? Like what is the feeling behind that? We also don't talk about feelings at work, but it's really feelings, and it tends to be fear that drives especially strong responses, strong on either side, right? So before starting with an initial defensive reaction or kind of attacking or investigative questions on the other person, just getting curious within. And then through that curiosity, also having compassion. And the compassion for others actually starts from compassion with yourself, compassion for yourself. If you've been traumatized, it's actually very hard to have that compassion for yourself, because the self-critic coming out of the shame is such a deep part of trauma. It's an impact of trauma, right? So on either side of a trauma fence, having the deep compassion for, as me, CEO, it is really hard. it is hard to meet, the needs of the greater good of the organization and the board. And there's demands from all sides that I have to meet, and they're often conflicting. And I've got my own stuff going on in my family and my personal life and all this sort of stuff. It's hard. It's really hard right now. And maybe I feel attacked, right? I as a leader, I can feel attacked. I don't know how to do things. Most of the stuff we don't have answers for because we've never done it. So why would we be able to, just because we have a title of leader, why would we somehow be able to magically figure out what to do? And maybe the demands or what's coming up from the employee is not something I can actually do. And maybe we really don't have the money for it, right? So having compassion for all of these things. And then care. Care is this is what I think also comes up as accommodation. Right? Like, oh, what does self-care look like? Or don't we have care because we have an employee assistance program, or we have flex time, or but care isn't just programs, or care isn't just money. Care can be something as simple as, what do you need right now? Like, Kim, come, let's talk we haven't talked for a bit, and I see that you seem kind of down. Everything okay? I don't know that I can solve anything. It's not my job to solve anything, but I'm here to listen. If you just want to talk, and let's figure something out together. Like, we're in this together. It's not just you have to fill out a business case for something and then I have to approve it. So bringing these things that are typically not business, things that are more personal into the conversation. And well, I'll add one that's not a C, but just the recognition, right? Mm-hmm. One of my mantras is, you can't heal what you haven't diagnosed. So I think we really have to get rid of the idea of, it's not just it's not personal, it's business. It's not. If that's the idea, then it's not business, it's abuse. Mm. We're actually abusing people by how we're denying their legitimate feelings, their needs, oh, that's not traumatic. Oh, but I didn't mean anything by that. Like, denying that can be traumatic. Like, we constantly talk about the self-doubt. If you're feeling like I'm mistreating you, or you're just feeling like something's a bad situation, and I'm constantly telling you, no, it's not. That's all in your head. Everything's fine. Don't you see it's normal? This is fine. Everybody else is dealing with it. You're the problem. What does that do to a person, right? So we have to stop that narrative as well.
Ooh, that's really powerful too. Just what you said too, that's abuse, right? And I think one of the challenges is that, like you said, I see this as both a challenge and an opportunity. Business is just a collection of humans, right?
Yes.
And so what we're talking about is this pressure, or this sort of societal mold that people have fallen into. And you talked about it in terms of myths and lies and things that stories we tell ourselves, right? As I move up the food chain, or whatever it is that I'm trying to achieve by conforming within my organization, that I've told myself that feelings should be checked at the door, or that I need a thicker skin, or, just kind of all of these things. And so if I'm not, to your point, being compassionate towards myself, where's the empathy going to come from for other people? Because I'm just saying, like, if I'm not taking the time to take care of myself, why should you be able to take care of yourself, right? Or if I don't understand that I have my own untended wounds, I'm not going to be thinking about yours. And so I think that there's this opportunity, if we can set aside these beliefs that somehow, like, too much vulnerability, or it's too squishy, or it doesn't belong in the business world, right? Like, going back to your earlier point about capitalism, it is actually in alignment. And not that I'm trying to promote capitalism here, but if that's the system we all belong to, it is in greater alignment with capitalism to take care of the needs of your employees, because you will get more out of them, right? You will actually achieve more of your capitalistic goals if you're tending to people in the ways that you described. So if you're not going to do it for the right reasons, if you're not going to do it because it's the right thing to do for humans, do it because it is the right thing for your business. Right? And I think that's where we still haven't been able to bridge that gap.
100%. I mean, you just have to look at high performance professional athletes. Part of their job is to sleep and to get massages and to take care of their bodies and to eat the right foods and to have fun, because the team bosses know if athletes do that, they will perform better in the arena that their sport is taking place in, right? So why on earth would work be different? Yeah, it's one of the many ways that we silo the portions of our society, thinking performance or productivity comes from doing more, or even worse, doing more with less, or working smarter, not harder. Like there's all these myths. I think we need to be working easier, not working smarter or harder. We need to be working easier.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And oh my gosh, Rosie, I could go on and on with you, and maybe we can do a part 2 of this sometime as well, because I feel like we just barely scratched the surface in this.
I'm up for it.
But I would love for you to share where people can find you and more of your work for anyone who's interested in connecting with you.
Thank you for asking that. I would love to connect with people. Actually, this is also my passion and mission. So I want to help people see and heal from their pain. And I'm most active on LinkedIn. So if you just search for me, Rosie Yeung, and my last name Yeung is spelled Yeung, it should hopefully come up. I'm also on Instagram, but the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. And my website is also changinglenses.ca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rosie. This has been just a wonderful conversation and a really important one.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.